workspace too.
Right.
So really, again, the keeping your eyes up and always having something to look at, giving them the respect. And then the tough part about waiting till they get dressed is a lot of times when they're dressed, they're out the door. And it does depend on the sport and the player. But,
And
you
the
know,
deadline.
here's a gang, this gang full of reporters, and everyone wants to get close, and then you're sitting there while the guy is getting dressed. So, like, it's hard to give them the respect. I always try to turn my back, but then you turn back and you're like on this outside of, so I would
Right.
position myself near the front, turn my back to just show them I'm giving them the respect.
Right.
And most women do that.
I don't think most men talk to just strictly, completely naked guys.
No, I've seen them,
You have?
because
Well-
they've done that because they don't want us to talk to
Oh,
them
well,
too.
that's true. It's a good point.
I think there's more issues with our peers than there are with players
Probably.
nowadays.
I think women are more respectful and the most respectful, and sometimes, I don't want to say that can come back to bite you, but you can turn your back again, and you're either on the outside of this, you're getting the second wave of the interview, and the guy doesn't want to answer the questions again, but I think it's more important to show them you're being respectful of their space and their privacy.
And I think the best thing I'm sorry, Cheryl, go ahead.
I had that happen with Duncan Keith, where, it was the second wave,
Right.
and I, because he was getting dressed, and it was second wave, and I said, I have to ask this question again, and he kind of blew up at me a little bit. Oh, okay, and I walked away, but he was really cool. He came running after me, and he goes, I'm sorry. And I appreciate that, because he knew that I was not trying to, hammer the question again. I said, this is what I needed
Well, I
to answer.
guarantee you, he recognized you, and I mean, that's the biggest advantage you have too, as any reporter, once they get to know you, they see you around, they know Kerry, they've seen her, they know Shannon, they know Cheryl, they know you guys, I'm sure, after you've been there a while, and you've asked professional questions, and they've seen your work, then all of a sudden, I mean, I covered the Bulls for many years, and, there's 12 guys, so, I mean, they better get to know you. After a while, you hate each other just because you're sick of each other. But Scottie Pippen would go, Melissa, turn around. And, because I was right on top of him talking to someone else, he'd be like, turn around for a second. I'd turn, he'd be like, okay. It was nice. I mean, I have one quick story about Pippen, because it's one of my favorites, and it's really dumb. But it kind of shows a few things. Years after Pippen retired, he was doing TV, I think on TNT, and I had asked him a couple questions just for another story, and so I kind of caught him at the stadium or at the UC, and he said, "Oh yeah, let's walk," and so we were walking and talking. We're walking towards the locker rooms, and he's got a suit bag over his shoulder, and we kind of duck into one of the visiting hockey locker rooms. It's wide open, empty. I'm thinking, okay, well maybe just wants a little quiet. Hangs up his suit bag, unzips it, drops his pants, and he's getting dressed into a suit. I'm like, what are you doing? Like that. And he's like, what? I go, oh, I'm dressing. He goes, it's just you. I go, okay, thanks. I mean, actually, it was a great compliment, He thought nothing of just dropping his drawers,
I had Steve Lyons was with the White Sox. And
Steve Lyons dropped his pants for
well,
everyone.
no, he struck a pose. He goes, and I'm interviewing somebody else, and he goes, Cheryl, and he struck a pose. He was completely naked, and I went, okay, how do I handle this? I went to the drugstore and I bought some suntan lotion, and I put a note. I go, you have to take care of some of your suntan lines. They're goofy. Because think about it, it's a clubhouse, it's a locker room, it's a boys' room. They're not men, they're little boys, and they just act like little boys, and so you treat them like such.
Right, it's not for us to be offended by them in their own domain, or else we shouldn't be there if we're going to be offended, and.
To that point of them being little boys, I remember I was covering the Buffalo Sabres the year they went to the Stanley Cup Finals in 1999, and their practice facility had a much smaller locker room with basically an open shower around one corner, and there were lockers leading up to that. Well, there was obviously a door that you could close, but that particular day, there was a player that I will still never know who it was, who decided to do jumping jacks to try to get me to look. And I could see this out of my peripheral vision, and I was like, oh, shit. What am I going to do with this? Like, you're trying to concentrate, first of all. So somebody left the group interview, and I slid so that my back was to the locker. And then whoever it was started to yell, hey, over here, hey, over here. And as soon as we finished, I said to my photographer, walk on this side of me when we go out. And he's like, okay? And so we walked out, and I mean, it was like this person did everything in their power. And I've had, oh gosh, myself and another a radio reporter in Seattle, Mike Cameron, who many of you will know from here, he would come up behind us, tap us on the shoulder, we'd both look, and he'd drop his towel. I mean, that was Mike from all things that I had been told before that. But it's just like, there are times you're just like, okay, whatever. I mean, this is so old, and we'd go back to our conversation. Those are the types of things that, you know, I look at now as like, man, it could have been totally could have been a lot worse, and we just laughed it off. But this stuff happens.
Segueing a bit, but still, in the locker room, because we don't want to leave there, but, it's too exciting and interesting. But, you know, we talked about, somebody touched on male colleagues and how they can help or hinder, and so I'd be curious how you found support or non-support. Real quick, another story, just because men, if they want to make it difficult, I've been in situations early in my career where an athlete will go, if she's here, I'm not talking. I actually remember a few times that happening. And so I'd look around like, are you with me? You know, and the men sometimes would be like, no, you know, even if they were my friend or, you know, my colleagues, they'd be like, oh. And then gradually through the years, maybe they'd be like, you know what, she's fine. Or even if she leaves, we leave. There's a little of that. One year, this story, it must have been late 80s, mid 80s, Nancy Lieberman, and she played for the Continental Basketball League. She was the first woman who played in a professional basketball league. And so she was in her own locker room, and she opens the door a crack, and I had come from the Orlando Sentinel, from Orlando to do this story, and it was in Tampa, and she knew I was coming. And she opens the door, and there's a bunch of guys and me, and she looks out, and she goes, like that. I'm like, you know, and I go running in. I was like so excited, but I did feel bad. Like, it's not to say I didn't talk to her for a while myself, but I did say, you know what, that's not cool. You know, it's not fair. I mean, I did have a little one-on-one with her, but who was I to do that if I was going to blame, you know, men for doing the same thing to me? So, I mean, how have you found male colleagues? You don't have to mention names, but in general, have you found men to be supportive? Have you, you know?
I mean, I don't work in locker rooms as much anymore because I work in
Not just in locker
production,
rooms,
but
yeah.
I'm speaking more so for colleagues. I think it depends on the age. Like, I found colleagues that are more my age, which is basically who I work with, they don't really think about it that much. I mean, there's always that shock when I can argue sports with them and they're like, wow, you actually know sports. And I'm like, well, that's why I work here. But I've noticed that they're just a lot more, they don't really think about it, you know, it's just we're coworkers, it's not a big deal. And I think with bosses, I've noticed that they tend to treat me differently than other people, like than males. Not on purpose, but I can just tell maybe the tone is a little bit different, or it takes a while for them to trust me, whereas I feel like maybe my male coworkers, they kind of hit it off a lot quicker. But it's just something you get used to, and you know, you just learn you kind of have to prove yourself with other people, but I think it's a lot better.
I think the issue is mostly with management.
Yeah.
I think management has a lot of older men who do not like women being in their area. And I think that's where the problem is. I think the peers are better because they are getting younger, but I still think there's that level there of management that still has, you know, they just don't want women doing it.
Well, that's what I was hoping the conversation would kind of segue into, you know, how many women have any of us seen in management? I would say, if any of you, because I sure have been. Yeah.
You know,
In sports management.
And I was going to say, you two would know these names. I mean, it's kind of been a pleasant surprise that if you take a look at least amongst TV stations in town, you have Jennifer Graves at ABC7, who's been the VP and news director there for a number of years. Marty Wilkie at Channel 2.
Yeah.
She's been a GM at WGN as well. So I think at least in this market, and to be able to say that a market of this size has had some women in not just news director roles, but GM and vice president roles, to me is impressive. That, I think, you know, unfortunately I've never worked under any of them. I did have one female news director, and I hate to say it, she was the worst manager I've ever had. She was a hindrance instead of a help, and that was unfortunate. But just looking around the immediate market, I've been pleasantly surprised at the number of women that have had mostly news director opportunities, granted, but also some GM opportunities.
But in radio,
Yeah,
there are
there's
no
none,
women.
right?
There are no women. In fact, we have all sports stations here in Chicago. There's not one woman that does a full-time talk show.
What do you think
None.
nationally for print? I mean, even
No, the numbers
editor. I
are
mean,
embarrassing, terrible.
It is.
Yeah, I mean, when I, was covering the Bulls, it was me and Tony Giannetti who were the two print reporters
Yeah.
in town, pretty much. I mean, yeah, Shannon came around and there was a few other women, there were women on the desk, but that's pretty much it. Do you see when you're out and about other women, not, and we get back to the locker room all the time, but just around, around teams,
Yeah.
in newsrooms, in studios, whatever, are you seeing more women?
I do, but I was just covering the NCAA tournament.
Yeah.
It's a humongous room. Those press conferences, it's like an auditorium of like reporters, and it was kind of funny because there was a panel like this, and it was like Mark Emmert, the NCAA president, and these university presidents and real important people, and we would all go back to like right at this, and one of the reporters is like, oh, that was a real diverse group, and I'm like, look around, like, I'm like, actually, they were a little more diverse than like this group asking them the questions. So I mean, there were, and I'm sure it's like way more than it has been, but I think especially though when I think there's more women that are getting into TV now, and maybe radio, I don't know, but I feel like print-wise, I don't see a lot of women getting into as much.
But I think the whole print industry is going
Well,
through
yeah,
such a
that is probably
metamorphosis
a good
right now
idea.
that it's hard to figure
Yeah.
out what's gonna
Mhm.
happen with that, because nowadays, if you want to get in this business, you have to be multi-purpose.
Right.
Yeah.
You have to be able to write, you have to be able to do on air, you have to be able to do digital filming, you have to do everything. And so, if you could do all that, I think the jobs are gonna be there for you.
But of those who are doing it, I see like, college-age men. And I
Right,
don't
and they're
see
also,
women.
they're
Yeah.
burning out really fast, too.
Yes.
Mhm.
I was, and I'm gonna open it up to the questions, and by all means break in if you want, but along those same lines, it used to be, I'm now working for W, which is an interesting full circle that I've come around to, because there was a time, and we'll see if you guys agree, when you first start out, if someone were to say, can you get a story on this woman athlete, or this athlete's wife, or, these women's issues, I can't quote now, single quotes maybe, that I would, be offended. We would be offended. If I was sent out to do a WNBA game, they weren't around early in my career, but I would have been offended. Or at least felt badly about it, because I was aspiring to do the top beats at the paper, which were not the women's beats. And then eventually throughout my career, I started feeling a little guilty about that, like, because women would come to you and say, why don't you cover us, or why don't you do this more? And you think, well, I want to do the Bears, and you feel kind of, and then pretty soon you kind of come around. And we still see women, I covered the Olympics over years, and they're all doing figure skating, and they like it, and that's fine, but they're all kind of in those women's beats. So again, I'd be curious how you feel about covering women, and just about that whole kind of thing. Let's just go down the line for that.
I would say, honestly, it's more people just don't want to cover women's sports than anything. Like, it's not necessarily just women. I know, since I start, from the bottom as production assistant, when you have to work on, I know people who did the women's tournament, because that's huge at ESPN, they were kind of bummed, like, oh, I wanted to work, on men's basketball, not women. So, like, it was a general consensus where I saw a lot of people be like, I don't really want to work on women's sports. So I feel like it was more just the image of the actual athletes than,
You think younger women were saying that, or younger men?
Yeah, both. It was, I had coworkers who worked on it.
Because the stories are great. Trust me, when you get older, you realize that the stories are actually outstanding.
And the production
And
for the
people aren't
tournament
telling
was
them,
great.
so it's even better, but yeah.
Yeah,
But
it's
I'm
just
glad for
like-
your honesty, it's interesting to hear that, yeah.
Well, I don't really cover
Yeah.
sports, but
When someone asks you,
yeah, when I worked at the school newspaper, I know extensively the women's tennis team, because they were really good at the time, and it was probably one of the better sports to cover. They were great stories. A lot of them were not from this country, and actually I spoke with one of them recently, probably about it within the last year, about, how she went on and got another job elsewhere, and how it was helpful to have someone write about her in the school newspaper, because it kind of, had shown her leadership skills and things like that. So I covered lots of women's sports, and I thought it was interesting, definitely interesting. The women's basketball team here obviously is a little bit better than the men's basketball team, so trying to be nice. So that was not a bad thing at all to cover that. That was kind of like almost a privilege to be able to cover the women at that time. So I think it's great. I guess I would probably agree with what you're saying though, because if it's Bulls versus WNBA, I'm probably watching the Bulls.
So you didn't even know the sky.
Well, I do know the sky. I was trying not to point out the sky because I have a lot of coworkers who work there. So, but it's just the way it is now. I think with I hope that changes, and I think it's kind of trending that way. especially with some of the like women's like soccer. I feel like that's definitely increasing with the women's Olympic team. I wasn't even here